So this is the first of several sessions by Ivan. It's starting us off with, what is the Raspberry Pi? Ivan, thank you.
Hello, KansasFest. Grab my notes. So, I am here to tell you all about the Raspberry Pi, and like Andy said, this will be the first of several sessions. I'd like to start by asking, I have up here, very much like the Apple II, a single tasking operating system, and cell phone rings generate interrupts, which I don't handle gracefully. So if you wouldn't mind silencing your phones, it would help me up here. Thank you. I am really excited to tell you about the Raspberry Pi today because it is probably the thing that I have had the most fun with in technology in the last, 5 years or something like that. It's just cool. And what it really reminds me of very much is the feeling that I had, and I still have, when working with an Apple II. And I think, I'm not going to, this is a short session, it's only a half hour, you might be able to extend a little for Q&A afterwards. So I'm going to go really fast, but I'm completely available for questions afterwards. But I think that the Raspberry Pi, which I'll tell you what it is, but it was very much started with a vision and a purpose, and you sort of appreciate that as you use it. And I think that's one of the non-technical things it has in common with the Apple II. And I have sort of made it a focus of mine to see how I can use the Raspberry Pi to make the Apple II more fun. Do stuff with the Apple II via the Pi. Make the Pi the general purpose Apple II peripheral. So I'll very briefly cover who makes the Raspberry Pi. It is made by the Raspberry Pi Foundation, which is a nonprofit and is dedicated, and the mission of it is to teach about programming to school children. And so to do that, its inventor developed this. I don't know how many of you have seen the Raspberry Pi, but this is what it is. And you're like, okay, that's a circuit board. What is it, though? What's so special about it? And I'll tell you what's special about it. It is a full-fledged general-purpose computer in the way that all of us think about computers. Something that you give some power to, has storage, you plug into a screen, you plug into a keyboard, and you use it. You use it to invent things, you use it to consume things, you use it to be productive. It is a computer. It is, and I want to stress that as I talk about this in this session and my other sessions, almost everything that you can do with a Raspberry Pi, you can certainly do with a PC. It's just that that PC is going to be more expensive, and it's going to have fans, and you can't run it off a battery, and it doesn't cost $35. Which is what the Raspberry Pi Model B costs. So I'm going to quickly show you or describe what its core capabilities are. So in terms of, okay, it's a computer, what do you mean? It's got an HDMI port for video to a digital monitor. It's got a composite video port for analog monitors. It does not have VGA. It has an audio port, headphone, stereo. It has 2 USBs. It has an Ethernet, 100 base T. And it takes power from micro USB, meaning you can use it with pretty much any decent cell phone adapter. And for storage, it uses an SD card. A slot port on the back. That's its hard drive. That's the whole deal. When you buy a Raspberry Pi, and there are actually only 2 licensed places in the US to buy it from, both mail order. They're on, in fact, I'll bring up the Raspberry Pi homepage. So this is the Raspberry Pi Central, where it's basically an ongoing blog of all these great projects that people are doing with their Pi. People are making cat feeders. People are making camera monitors, Wi-Fi cameras. People are using it to stream video and do home media systems, all based on their Raspberry Pis. And this is sort of the central point that you'll want to visit for the ongoing news about that. You can see that there is Buy a Pi. These are the 2 places in the US, Allied Electronics and Element 14. it winds up being closer to $45 shipped. You can buy them from other places, but they're just buying them from these places and reselling them with a little bit of there is also, and it has, I forgot to mention, it has 512 megabytes of RAM, so half a gig of RAM, which is not a lot. But there's also a Model A. The Model A is this is called a Model B, and it was actually first to market. The original version of the Model B had 256 meg of RAM, then they revised it. It's the second revision, it has 512. The Model A came out later. It has only one USB port, it has 256 megabytes of RAM, and it has no Ethernet port. It costs $25 instead of $35. In my opinion, the only real reason to get the Model A is if you want to do something battery powered and you want it to be low power, because it consumes less power because it doesn't have to feed the Ethernet port and the additional USB port. Otherwise, get a Model B. It's much more flexible. Okay, so the benefits of the Raspberry Pi as a general purpose computer are that it's cheap, or that it's tiny, or that it's silent, and you can power it off a battery if you want to. The cons of the Raspberry Pi are that it is not very powerful. It is, probably comparable to the computing power of a computer from 10 or more years ago. I mean, it's comparatively slow, so you shouldn't expect, like, oh, this is my next desktop PC. And its low RAM capabilities means that there's limited support for a lot of things. Like, you're not going to be able to browse every modern website with the browser that can run on a Raspberry Pi. There is no clock on board. That is for cost reasons, according to the Raspberry Pi Foundation. And it gets its time from the internet. And finally, another potential issue is that it is not an x86 chip, an Intel-based architecture such that you'll find in most computers. And what that means is that a lot of software, if it hasn't been recompiled to use the ARM chip, it's not going to run on the Pi, even if it otherwise runs on Linux, which is the usual operating system that you use on a Pi. So that gets into issues with things like hardware drivers. For example, there are many fewer Wi-Fi adapters that you can use with a Raspberry Pi than you could with a general computer, because those drivers are binaries. The binaries are made for Intel chips. This has an ARM chip, not going to work unless somebody recompiles it. So you get your choice of operating systems when you use a Raspberry Pi, and when it came out, there really was hardly anything. They basically said, okay, here's the raw deal. What has emerged is that there are various versions of Linux and a couple of other operating systems that are sort of obscure that run on the Raspberry Pi. The official version, and what most Raspberry Pi people use, and what I recommend most people use for the first time, is called Raspbian. And Raspbian is a Raspberry Pi version of the Debian operating system. And Debian is, so I'm going to take a brief detour, into the world of Unix and Linux, because it is not like the world of Mac and Windows, which come from single entities. Unix is a very old operating system that predates the Apple II. There are thousands of variations of it. Mac OS X is a Unix type operating system. It is in fact a Unix operating system. I'm going to use the term Unix loosely. People, officially, an operating system has to have a certain set of properties and be officially termed as Unix. But as far as I'm concerned, if LS gives you files and DD copies a disk and tar makes an archive, it's Unix. And that's the way I'm going to be using the term Unix today. Linux, if I'm not mistaken, is not officially a Unix, but it is certainly Unix. So Mac OS X runs a version of Unix. We don't have to get into all the details of it, but it's one of the major families. It's derived from one of the major families of Unix called BSD. Linux is a different major family of Unix. And within Linux, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of customized variations, which are called distributions in Linux speak. And each distribution has its own properties, but they're, at least according to one chart, which I'll show you, there are, whoa is right. These are all different Linuxes. Yeah, that's right. And it's probably not even comprehensive, because how could it be? But you will see, if you look down the left side, it puts them apart from like various little oddballs like that one. Those ones. It has like 3 major ones, which are Debian, Slackware, and Red Hat. I am not a super, super deep, long history Linux guy, so I can't really tell you what makes Slackware versus Debian versus Red Hat different, but I can tell you that Debian is the one that I know, and I have played with the other ones, and I'm like, this is somewhat unfamiliar in some ways. So there are differences that are meaningful, but Debian has gained some popularity and recognition because if you're dabbling with Unix for the first time, Ubuntu, which perhaps you've heard of, has made it its mission to really be the user-friendly Unix with a beautiful GUI, and like this is a desktop operating system where you don't need to be a tech person to use it. Ubuntu is built on top of Debian. The other point I want to make about Linux is that it is fundamentally, like DOS and ProDOS, a command line operating system. There are graphical interfaces for it. There is no one standard graphical interface for Unix or Linux, or even one particular distribution of Linux. You can put in different graphical interfaces if you want to, and people do. What is core is that really, in the end, it's about the command line. So the command line is intimidating for a lot of people, but what I want to stress is that it's just fancy DOS. It's just fancy ProDOS. It's endless, like the pool is so deep you can't believe how much you can learn and you still figure out, and it's fun. But it's not something that is unapproachable or insurmountable. So that's Linux. So Linux is Debian Linux is the prime, or Raspbian, which is the Raspberry Pi version of Debian, is the version of Linux that Raspberry Pi uses. Some people have ported other operating systems. One person wrote a chess program in ARM assembly language that just boots straight to Pi. It's its own operating system. It's not like it boots an operating system first. So you can invent whatever you want with this thing. It works easily because the SD card is partitioned to have a small fat partition, which has a kernel file on it. That's what gets booted and executed. And it's easy to, since fat is recognized by every operating system pretty much, you can copy it in. And I'll talk briefly about that. Then the rest of the card is a Unix-specific file system called ext4. So so I just also FYI, I don't really do the GUI much on the Raspberry Pi or any other Unix. For me, it's interesting as a way of doing kind of programming, running services. I'll be talking about that in my other sessions. If I want to use a GUI, I use my Mac. It's a really nice GUI. I'm going to boot up the Raspberry Pi and stop talking about it. On my particular Raspberry Pi, I bought a third-party adapter that allows you to use a micro SD card instead of an SD card because it makes it flush, it makes it cuter, and it makes it fall out less. Okay, and I'm also, so just because I can, and I'm going to be living dangerously here, I am going to use a Wi-Fi adapter. Ooh, cute. It's a Wi-Fi adapter. This is, it is called Attenda. I have a page, I will show you my Raspberry Pi page actually, in which I detail some my reports on various Wi-Fi adapters. I bought it because the common small ones don't work with A2 server, but this one does, as it turns out. So I need that plugged in, and I need this plugged in. And then, just because I can, I'm going to run it off a USB battery pack. All right, it's plugged in. You can see there's an LED that fires up when hopefully the others will start firing soon too, indicating disk activity. And what I meant to do was, in fact, I'm going to unplug it so you can see this. hopefully. I want you to see a boot. So I'm going to plug in this composite cable. I'm going to switch the input on the projector here to, oh, it wants a feed. Can I manually make it choose video? All right, well, you're not going to, all right, well, fine. Let's get it some power. Let's switch on the input. Yeah, okay, that's what you see. Is there a way to, no, that's correct, actually. That's like, I think, what the ROM in the Pi shows before it even loads anything with the operating system. All right, there it is. That is Raspbian Linux booting up. It's a lot of stuff. You don't have to understand all that stuff. I don't. There is a great deal about Linux that I don't understand, but continue to learn. And one benefit of the Raspberry Pi for me has been that I have learned a great deal about Linux, which has been extremely helpful on my Mac, which also is a Unix-based operating system. All right, so boom, there we are. Now, if we're extremely lucky, oh yeah. So I will tell you more about this later, but you will notice that I am using not a USB keyboard and mouse, but an Apple IIc as my keyboard. No, what you saw last night was Retro Connector, which is also awesome, which actually uses the keyboard of an Apple IIc and interfaces it to USB. You could do that too, and we saw that, in fact. This uses something different, which I'll tell you about in a minute. So, here we are. This is what you're going to see when you boot it up. You are on the command line. It is waiting for you to do something. I skipped over one quick part. I don't want to dwell too long on it. You set up this card by downloading an image off the Raspberry Pi website. You unpack all the files on your computer, you copy them to this card, then you pop it in the Raspberry Pi, and if you've got video attached to the Pi, it will actually then take you through an operating system installation process. So it's much easier than it used to be. If you've got a Mac, you can also download just the operating system image that you want, and I wrote a utility called PiFiller. And in fact, I meant to show you, actually, well, maybe I'll show you on the Pi if we can. All right, so I'm going to show you the GUI, even though I don't spend any time in the GUI. Unix GUIs all share in common something called X Windows, which is a Unix standard for doing GUIs and showing windows. So here you are. This is your Raspberry Pi GUI. Now, you'll see that you can do things like configure Wi-Fi, and Midori is the browser. It's not a very robust browser, but maybe it's good enough to...
So using that Apple II mouse?
Yeah! How cool was that? Thank you, Eric, for letting me borrow it. All right. So, oh yeah, here we are on my Raspberry Pi page. Let's go to the bottom of the page and go back to the Raspberry Pi homepage. So this is at, you can't see it up at the top, but this is at ivanx.com/Raspberry Pi. What you will find at ivanx.com/Raspberry Pi is PiFiller, which allows you to copy an operating system image to your Pi, PiCopier, which lets you back up your card to an image on your computer, PiFinder, which will find the IP address of your Raspberry Pi on your LAN if your router gave it an IP address and you don't know what it is and you don't have a screen attached to it. Because you can, and I usually do, use the Pi headless, meaning without any keyboard or screen attached to it. I have a page on getting it to work with Wi-Fi and what kind of adapters to use. A2 server I'll be talking about tomorrow. It turns the Raspberry Pi into a file server for Apple IIs. And then finally, Apple II emulators for easy installation on a Raspberry Pi. So ivanx.com/Raspberry Pi is a resource to you, the Apple II Raspberry Pi user. Okay, so back to the GUI here. I'm not going to show you anything else in the GUI because there's a Pi store with absolutely nothing worthwhile in it. I don't suggest you spend much time in it. But there are some programming environments here, Scratch, and it's something to. I honestly can't tell you much about this because I am almost never in the GUI. But it's there, and people use it. Here. The question is also, how can you connect to your Pi? So one way is to attach a keyboard and a mouse and a screen and use it like a conventional computer. That's sort of what we're doing here, except we're being a little fancy and using the 2C. But what I do most of the time is run my Pi without a keyboard or screen attached to it, and I instead control it exclusively from my computer. So that means usually, since I just care about the command line, I could give a whole separate session on SSH one day, but I don't know that I can. I guess I could, maybe. No, whoops, that's wrong. Oh yeah, you're right. All right. So, can you read it better now? All right, great. All right, here we are. I am now in the Pi, and I can do all my Pi stuff in my terminal window on my Mac. Or if you're on Windows, you can use PuTTY to do the same thing. This is just, for me, the way to go, because what I want to do is work on the command line. If I want to see the GUI, so one thing I didn't mention is that it's relatively easy once you get how to install additional software on the Raspberry Pi. I'm not going to get into the details, but it's a command called apt-get, and it automatically sucks down vast libraries of existing software. So I have installed a package, they're called packages. I've installed a package called XRDP on here that allows you to connect to the Raspberry Pi desktop using a remote desktop connection client, which you can, so this comes with Windows, this is from Microsoft, you can download it from the Mac, or you can use the one that ships on Windows. This also has a VNC server, which is more complicated to set up, but if you want to connect with a VNC client because you hate Microsoft or something, you can certainly do that.
Was it 215?
Oh, thank you very much, sir. It is going to work. All right, because I installed XRDP, I can actually just get right to my Raspberry Pi desktop on my Mac, and I can leave my Raspberry Pi plugged in next to my router and forget about it. I never shut it down. It's just, you know.
More real estate that way.
You actually do get more real estate that way, as it turns out. Part of the reason for that is because I was connected via composite to the projector, and just the resolution is very low. So, I've shown you how to connect. You can do keyboard mouse video. You can do remote desktop or VNC. Here, let's actually do this properly. There we go.
So it creates an entirely new web session.
Yep. It actually doesn't create next session. Well, I guess it does. I don't actually know what it does. But no, that's fine. But I'm glad you mentioned it. So a third thing, which is a totally alien concept to Mac and Windows users, is that X Windows lets you arbitrarily display an application window on a remote computer. It doesn't care whether it's local or remote. So actually, let me log it, or exit, and let me SSH with -X. So what you need to do is install software that's called an X Windows server. That's on the Mac, you can download Xports. It's free, it's simple, you just install it. I have it installed, you don't even see it happen, but what it does is allows you to run a graphic program, and the window will display on your Mac as opposed to the whole Raspberry Pi desktop. You'll get just the window. Now, I have already downloaded and installed Kegs. Oh, except I probably forgot to put on a ROM, so this is all you're going to see. But I can show you LinApple, which is pretty. Yeah, it's pretty. But the point is, this is the Raspberry Pi running an Apple II emulator, which is awesome. How do you leave Kegs? Does anybody know? Oh, Control-C. Duh. Actually, no, you can't. All right, I'm just going to close that X Windows session. Okay, so here I am. Rather than running over X Windows, which is super slow, I'm going to go back to the remote desktop, and there's an Apple IIe emulator, which is also on my webpage. Both Kegs and LinApple are on my webpage. They're both Apple IIe emulators. It's going to look a little faster if I do it here. I have to run it from the terminal program in the GUI, and I'm going to type LinApple. I know it's tiny, but deal with it. And, all right, let's go F2 to reset, and boom, it's an Apple IIe, and it's got a silly hello program. Okay, so what do you do with a Raspberry Pi? You play, you invent, you learn, you enjoy. It's for projects. It's for fun. It's not for productivity, but it's certainly for learning. I am not a hardware guy at all. I'm a software guy. Like my Dad got the Apple II in 1978. I was 8 years old. I typed Control B. I was an integer basic, and I was just like going to town. I'm like, oh my god, like bits made sense instantaneously. I also had a Radio Shack electronics kit with all the springs and everything. Took electronic classes. None of that took any kind of root. I don't get electrons. I do get bits. But people are doing amazing hardware things with the Raspberry Pi. I kind of alluded to some of them. The best place to read about those cool things are on the Raspberry Pi homepage. There is a general purpose expansion connector with a bunch of pins I forgot to mention. That's for interfacing with stuff. I won't get into the stuff because I don't understand how they work. Finally, the last thing, I'm almost out of time, but I wanted to, you're like, well, how are you doing this Apple II thing? So one of a really great project is by our esteemed David Schmenk, who last year created the first-person action game, Escape from Homebrew Computer Club, and like, which blew my mind. I'm like, you're my hero. Well, he's my hero again because he has written a project called Apple II Pi, and what it does is it allows you to use an Apple II keyboard and mouse to. Oh, it's not showing you because we're not directly connected. We can switch to the Pi video, which I'll do. Oh, well, we're not in the GUI, but anyway, but we have the keyboard, and when we're in the GUI, we have the mouse. So Apple II Pi is a client and server thing. I booted the Apple II Pi floppy on my Apple IIc. My Apple IIc is connected by a serial interface to a USB to serial adapter, which is plugged into my Pi. And then I ran the Apple II Pi server on the Raspberry Pi. Raspberry Pi listens for a keyboard and mouse coming from the Apple IIc, being provided by the software that's in the disk. And boom, this is awesome. This is like, I'm not worthy. What?
I'm not sure I get the light from Raspberry Pi.
No, I don't like it at all. It's terrible. What a failed lackluster effort. Some accessories you might want for the Raspberry Pi are obviously an SD card. You can run it on a 2 gig SD card. Don't do that. Get at least a 4 gig SD card. There's just not enough room to be happy with the 2 gig. You can get a Wi-Fi adapter. I showed you that. I'll be talking more about those tomorrow. If you want to draw access to the Raspberry Pi and be able to kind of like get in at a lower level remotely, you might want to get a USB to serial adapter and a console cable. I will talk more about those tomorrow. The Raspberry Pi Foundation has released a camera for the Raspberry Pi and I guess some software that operates it. I don't know much about it. You might want to get a case for it. I don't bother. I just like, if it breaks, well, that sucks, but it's $35. It's amazing. It hasn't broken yet, I should say. It's and then there's tons of other stuff out there. People are just creating neat stuff for it all the time. It's inspired people to invent, and that's what I love about it. And it's inspired me to figure out how to invent with the Apple II, and that's what I love about it. So thank you. And are there any questions? Sir.
One thing that you just alluded to, but you didn't really mention much, is the hacking aspect of the Pi. It does have the general purpose I/O pins on it.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that and some of the things that you could do with those?
No.
Okay.
Because I don't know. I know that they are there, and I don't, and I'm not that deep on the various things. But I mean, do you want to say a word or two about it? Because I think you probably have a better idea than I do.
Only that they're there.
Yeah, that's what I can say.
They're addressable in the same way that people would use an Arduino. You can read from the pin, write to the pin, hook up potentiometers to it, hook it up to a breadboard.
So in that way, it's not directly analogous, but it's somewhat like an Apple II expansion slot. There are pins that you can address in software and use that to interface with whatever you like, to make whatever hardware you like.
So did you have to, were you able to apt-get kegs or LinApple?
No, I had to compile kegs in LinApple. There's also GSPort, which is a variant of kegs. But I have the precompiled binaries on my website, so that if you want to just download them without having to compile it yourself, you can.
And did you have to compile them on the Pi?
Yes. I didn't have to. You can cross-compile if you know how to do that, but they're small programs and there's no reason not to. There are other cases where...
Did that come on with all
Yes, the Pi comes ready to compile. You don't have to install any packages to compile. It's got GCC on it already. And also, for what it's worth, Python is considered to be the official development language of the Raspberry Pi, but it is just like any other Debian Linux, and you can program in whatever language you want to, be that C or Ruby or pick your language. Gibberish. Yeah.
Just to get a feel for this, how these are taken off around the world, now that there's been over 1 million sales since it was released.
I can't hear you. Could you repeat the question?
There's been over 1 million units sold. 1 million sales.
Yes, that's right. There have been over 1 million sales in Pi. It's been a phenomenally successful product. Certainly in the hobbyist community, it's been an earthquake. It's been huge.
I attended Maker Fair a couple months ago in San Mateo, and it's
all Pis?
Amazing. And it was every other booth was Raspberry Pi or Arduino. I mean, it's just taken over the Maker community.
Yeah, no, it's huge. And I think one of the things that's appealing about
mind-boggling.
It is, and I think for me, one of the things that's appealing about the Pi is like Arduino is awesome, but it seems like it's really like about doing cool like hardware-y stuff, and I want to do cool software-y stuff. So having a general purpose Unix-based computer was more suited to my needs. Plus, my particular Apple II needs, I wanted to use existing software that was out there for Linux and make it run on the Pi. I'll be saying much more about that tomorrow. By the way, while it's on my mind, tomorrow I have 2 sessions back-to-back, A2 Server and A2 Cloud. Though A2 Cloud is listed at 2:30, I don't know exactly when I'm going to make that transition. So if you want to make sure you get A2 Cloud, you should come for both.
Also, there's a lot on the online community for Raspberry Pi, but I'm also heavily involved with hackerspaces. And I would also encourage you to go to your local hackerspace. A lot of hackerspaces are working with the Pis, and it's a good resource to get together for sources on things. And also, if you're getting involved with the hardware aspect of it, a lot of times having hands-on with other people is extremely helpful as well.
That's a wonderful suggestion. Thank you. Again, if anybody didn't hear that, there exist hacker spaces in many communities, which are places where like people get together and like do cool stuff and invent things. And doing that in the community is a wonderful way to learn and be inspired and get new ideas. Any other questions?